In the spring of 1907, a well-dressed man walked into the kitchen of a large brownstone house in New York, which belonged to a wealthy family. The woman, busy cooking at the stove, hadn't noticed him enter. The man cleared his throat. The woman realised she was not alone. As she turned around and their eyes met, her face turned ghostly pale, gripping the kitchen counter as panic crept through her body. Because she recognised this man. He'd been chasing her for months. The man asked her to politely come with him, but the woman's eyes were already searching over the kitchen counter in front of her, finally settling on a large, sharp metal fork used for carving meat. Picking up the fork, her hand trembling with a mixture of fear and anger, she pointed it towards the man. She decided she wouldn't be going anywhere, not without a fight. It was a humid evening at the end of summer in New York, 1906. A man called George Soper sat in his office working when he received a call. It was a landlord called George Thompson from Long Island. Mr. Thompson had rented out his luxurious property in Oyster Bay to a wealthy banker called Charles Henry Warren. While the family initially enjoyed their stay at the property, something had gone horribly wrong. Now 6 people at the house were fighting for their lives. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, told George that during the week of the 27th of August to the 3rd of September, 6 of the 11 guests staying at the house had contracted typhoid fever. Typhoid fever is a life-threatening infection caused by the bacteria Salmonella typhi. It's usually spread through contaminated food and water. The symptoms of typhoid fever start with a high temperature, diarrhea, and if it isn't treated with antibiotics, it can progress into delirium and death. Unfortunately, at the time, antibiotics hadn't been discovered, which meant typhoid would kill 10% of people unlucky enough to catch it. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, told George that he suspected that the water supply to the house had been contaminated. And if word got out that his property's water supply had given the family of a wealthy banker typhoid, he'd never be able to rent it again. That's why the landlord had called George Soper, because he had a kind of unusual set of skills he'd become well known for. George wasn't a detective, but people kind of treated him like one. He was a civil engineer by trade and an expert in sanitation. He'd become famous for stopping outbreaks of deadly disease across New York. Using his skills as an engineer and his logical way of thinking, he was known for his thorough investigations. That's why the landlord was putting so much faith in him to find the cause of the outbreak quickly, before word got out. George Soper told the landlord not to worry. He'd be there first thing tomorrow to look into it.
I'll be there right away.
He put down the phone and started to pack his bags. As George carefully packed his belongings, he couldn't help but wonder, how had a disease normally found in the cramped and unsanitary slums of New York found its way into a luxurious house in Oyster Bay? This disease almost exclusively ravaged the tightly packed streets of cities like New York, but now its deadly reach had entered the houses of the rich. George knew from his experience that if he didn't find the source of the outbreak quickly, it would spread, and inevitably, people would die. George Soper arrived in Long Island the next morning and wasted no time in his investigation of the house in Oyster Bay. He took water samples from pipes, faucets, toilets, and the cesspool, looking for the source of the contamination. George analysed the results. They were all negative for typhoid, which surprised him, as contaminated water usually was the source of these outbreaks. Undeterred, George set about interviewing the family and servants, asking what food they had all eaten recently, suspecting that if the contamination wasn't in the water, the disease was due to unsanitary food. A few of the family members thought for a while, but couldn't really think of anything unusual. Until one of them remembered an unusual food that they'd all eaten for the first time recently: soft clams. George felt like he was onto something, with seafood being a very common source of food poisoning. He reasoned that the clams were the source of the Salmonella bacteria, which was causing the typhoid fever. So with this new information, George thought he'd better go and interview the cook, to see if they'd noticed anything unusual about those clams. When he entered the kitchen, he found the cook busy working at the stove. George introduced himself, and she said her name was Mary Mallon. George asked her if she'd noticed anything unusual about the clams she'd served to the family, and Mary said no, she hadn't, and they seemed perfectly fresh to her. George noticed that Mary looked a bit flushed and red in the face, so he asked her how she was feeling. George's questions seemed to have prompted a change in Mary's attitude, her Irish accent becoming stronger when she snapped back that she was perfectly healthy. George didn't push it any further, as he felt that she was probably stressed due to the outbreak and being new to working with the Warren family, only taking the job around 3 weeks previously. He thanked her, told her not to worry, and left. George rang the landlord and explained his suspicions about the soft clams being the source of the contamination. The landlord seemed pleased with this discovery. He could blame the clams and re-rent his house as soon as possible. George sensed his relief. All that was left was to write his official report. Late that night, as he was going through the notes, preparing to write the report, he noticed one detail that would change the course of the investigation and his life forever. George sat at his desk, lit by a single lamp. Closing his notebook, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. His reputation for being meticulous in his investigations took its toll. It was another late night poring over his notes. He put his glasses back on and started on the stack of notes he'd made during the family's interviews. As he read, he realised that he'd overlooked a key detail in the case. Not every person who contracted typhoid had eaten those soft clams. He tried to justify it to himself that the people who didn't eat the clams probably caught it from the already infected people in the house. But people had become sick so quickly, the timeline for infection just didn't add up. But at this point it was too late. The landlord was happy blaming the clams. George had finished the investigation and was in the process of writing his final report, which would be released to the public. But George had to make sure that he'd checked every detail one final time, however minor. And he had one more rather unusual theory that he was desperate to test. George woke early the next morning. Gathering his sample kit, he went to find all the members of the house who hadn't become sick with typhoid. Because, after all his experience with battling typhoid and other epidemics in New York, he'd come to a startling conclusion. He believed that typhoid could be spread by one person serving as a carrier, spreading it to everything they touched, but never became sick themselves. George thought that maybe a member of the household could be a carrier, so he decided to collect samples from the healthy people in the house. By the end of the day, the last set of samples he needed was from the cook, so he went to the kitchen to find her. When he arrived, he found it empty. A housemaid, arms bundled with clean linen, walked past the kitchen door. George ran to catch her. He asked the girl where Mary was, the cook that he'd spoken to previously, as he needed to speak with her again. The girl told him that she'd left that morning. He asked her if she knew where she'd gone. No, she said. She hadn't left any forwarding address. George analysed the sample results from everyone in the house. They were all negative for typhoid. That left the missing cook Mary as the only member of the house untested. If she was the carrier, then hundreds, if not thousands of people's lives could be at stake. But she'd vanished into the overcrowded streets of New York. George returned to his office in New York, determined to track Mary down. But in the early 1900s, New York had a rapidly expanding population, the perfect place for Mary to disappear into. George scoured the records for any information about the missing cook. He discovered that she'd emigrated to New York from Ireland. Mary worked hard in various domestic jobs for wealthy New York families, before finally achieving a higher paid job as a cook. George carefully traced her movements from family to family, noticing an unusual pattern. Mary would stay for a short time, then leave. He discovered Mary had worked for 8 different families recently, only spending a few weeks with each, which he thought was odd. He contacted each of the families for more information, finding that 7 had recently suffered outbreaks of typhoid, with 22 people becoming seriously ill, and sadly, 1 little girl had died. George knew that Mary was working as a cook for another unsuspecting family right now. He had to find her. If his theory was correct, it was inevitable more people would die. 4 months had passed since George had last seen Mary at the house in Oyster Bay. He'd been close to catching up with her a few times, once arriving only hours after she'd left. Mary was proving more difficult to track down than he'd ever imagined. One morning, the phone rang in his office. George picked it up, and the caller suggested that he should visit a brownstone house on Park Avenue. It was owned by a wealthy family, and they had just reported a new case of typhoid. George grabbed his coat and raced to the house. He was suspicious Mary was involved in this new outbreak, and maybe he could catch her if she hadn't moved on. When he arrived, he explained his theory to the family. The family confirmed that they had just employed an Irish lady named Mary as their cook only a few weeks previously.
George asked hesitantly, had she left yet? The family said no, and he was welcome to talk to her. She was just in the kitchen.
George walked down the long, narrow hall to the kitchen. The family's cook was busy at the stove with her back to him. George coughed loudly to attract her attention. She turned around and their eyes met. It was Mary Mallon. He'd finally found her. He explained who he was and reminded her that they'd first met in the kitchen at Oyster Bay. George explained to Mary that he thought that she might be carrying typhoid, but be healthy herself. He wanted to take samples from her to prove it.
As soon as George finished speaking, Mary's mood turned to rage. She shouted at George that he was wrong.
Typhoid was everywhere. She hadn't spread it. It was contaminated food and water that she'd nothing to do with. She'd read it in the papers. There were outbreaks all the time in New York, whereas she'd never had typhoid in her life. George had tried to be as delicate as possible, explaining his theory to Mary, but her anger had turned to rage. Her eyes darting across the kitchen table, she grabbed a sharp carving fork laid out for that night's dinner. She pointed it at George and ran at him with the fork. George jumped out of the way, stumbled backwards into the wall, and then ran rapidly along the long, narrow hall, through the tall iron gate at the front of the house, and onto the sidewalk, feeling rather lucky to escape.
He realised that Mary wasn't going to be cooperative in giving him the samples he needed to prove his theory. He would have to come back with reinforcements before she had the chance to disappear again.
The next day, George and a lady called Dr. Baker from the Department of Health arrived with 5 policemen. He'd managed to convince Dr. Baker of his theory that Mary was a carrier of typhoid and the danger to public health that she posed working as a cook. The police van arrived at the brownstone house on Park Avenue. As they left the van and assembled on the sidewalk to work out a plan, Dr. Baker noticed Mary peering out of the window. She clutched the sharp carving fork from the previous day's attack in her hand. The police, George and Dr. Baker all readied themselves for the fight that they knew was coming and entered the house together. Once inside, they found Mary in the kitchen. Dr. Baker stepped forward and tried to gently explain that they needed samples from Mary. Mary flew into a rage and lunged at Dr. Baker with the carving fork. The sharp fork narrowly missed Dr. Baker, and she fell back into the policeman behind her, knocking 2 of them over. In the chaos, Mary managed to run from the kitchen and completely disappear. The police searched the house but found no trace of her until someone noticed that the house next door's window was open.
Police entered the neighbour's house and thoroughly searched it. In a closet, they found Mary hiding. She came out fighting and cursing the police. 5 policemen grabbed her,
struggling to get her in the van waiting outside. With Mary finally in the van, they set off for the local hospital. Dr. Baker even had to lay herself over Mary's legs to stop her escaping. Dr. Baker later said that the ride in the van to the hospital was like being in a cage with an angry lion. After arriving at the hospital, they forced Mary to give samples, which all tested positive for Salmonella typhi, the bacteria that causes typhoid fever.
Meaning that George Soper's theory was correct, and the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid had been discovered.
After the confirmation that Mary was a typhoid carrier, she was taken to North Brother Island for quarantine. North Brother Island is a tiny island near the Bronx in New York. It was the site of a smallpox hospital built in the 1850s.
They gave her a tiny house to live in away from the main hospital, but Mary didn't accept that she was a carrier of typhoid, as she'd never had symptoms herself.
Soper concluded that it was Mary who had transmitted the typhoid to the family of the wealthy banker in Oyster Bay, not the soft clams. But surprisingly, not through her cooked meals, as the heat would have killed the bacteria, but through Mary's famous peach ice cream, which she served on Sundays. There was also the disgusting fact that she almost never washed her hands, which was normal for the time, as back then people didn't really accept germ theory. As George Soper wrote about Mary's peach ice cream,
I suppose no better method could be found for a cook to cleanse her hands of microbes and infect an entire family.
In time, doctors at the hospital on North Brother Island would offer Mary a cure. They suspected the source of her infection was in her gallbladder. They offered to remove it and said she could go back to her normal life. But Mary refused, as the operation could be fatal, and she still didn't believe that she carried typhoid. Mary decided to sue the New York Department of Health for kidnapping and keeping her in quarantine illegally.
The case was brought to the Supreme Court as it raised difficult questions about the balances of people's freedom against the risk that they pose to public health.
The court ruled against Mary and ordered that she be kept in quarantine on North Brother Island. Mary didn't stop fighting for her freedom. A year later, the city had a new health commissioner, and Mary convinced him that she should be freed. He agreed on one condition, that she'd never work as a cook again. Mary agreed to this and she was released.
Unfortunately, for the unsuspecting people of New York, Mary would not keep that promise.
A few years later, George Soper answered the telephone in his office. It was a Dr. Edward Craggin at the Sloan Hospital for Women. He needed his help. His hospital had a dangerous outbreak of typhoid. 25 people had contracted the disease, and unfortunately 2 had died. George had received more calls than ever after his discovery of Mary. Dr. Craggin was keen to secure his help to stop this outbreak. George said he'd be there as soon as he could, and he put down the phone. When George arrived at the Sloan Hospital the following morning, he did all his usual testing of the water supplies, the food, and checking the sanitation. But by now a bit wiser, his attention turned to the staff, any one of which he knew could be a typhoid carrier. Gathering a list of everyone who worked at the hospital, he started interviewing them and taking samples. He interviewed and tested person after person, but so far all the tests had come back negative. George asked about the cooks at the hospital. The staff told him that they'd all been there for a long time and they'd never had any issues.
Except one. She'd been employed a few weeks ago, a Mrs. Brown. George felt suspicious. He headed to the kitchens right away.
He was met by the head cook. He asked where Mrs. Brown was. The head cook informed him that she'd quit her job just recently, around the same time as the first typhoid cases. George asked where she'd gone, and the cook said she hadn't left an address. George found copies of Mrs. Brown's handwriting and interviewed staff for a physical description. He was certain it was Mary, and she was working as a cook again. Police would eventually track Mary down. She'd been using false names like Brown and Breshoff to evade the Department of Health. When she was originally released from quarantine, she'd found work in a laundry, but the pay was less than half of what she'd received as a cook. So over time, she slowly drifted back towards cooking. But Mary couldn't get a job with wealthy families anymore, as the job agencies knew her history. So she drifted between restaurants, hotels, and spas in New York. At almost every place she'd worked, a new outbreak of typhoid happened. Mary would be sent back to quarantine for the rest of her life. But she would always maintain that she hadn't spread the disease. After her death, an autopsy was performed, and traces of a typhoid infection were found living in her gallbladder. Mary Mallon would be remembered as the first identified superspreader and nicknamed Typhoid Mary by the press. Even though 400 more superspreaders would be identified over the next few years, she was the only one to be forced into quarantine.
People's opinions had unfortunately turned against her when she failed to stop working as a cook.
She died on North Brother Island 23 years later.